Snow fell heavy that night, thick flakes tumbling from a swollen sky, settling like cold ashes on the roofs of a quiet American village tucked against the endless prairie. It was the kind of town where the wooden storefronts leaned with age, where the saloon doors creaked every time the wind swept through, and where whispers of men's sins carried longer than any sermon on a Sunday morning. Folks lived close to the land, and closer still to each other's business. But even in a place where stories spread faster than fire through dry grass, no one could have expected the cruel act that would set hearts trembling and eyes searching in the dark just beyond the last lantern glow of the village. Past the frozen creek and the cattle fences rattling in the storm, there sat a ranch bigger than any man rightly needed. Its owner was a man feared more than he was respected. A rancher known not for kindness, but for a heart colder than the ground in midwinter. He carried himself with the pride of someone who thought land, money, and muscle could buy silence. Villagers knew him as the sort to drive his men hard, strike his animals when they faltered, and laugh at the misfortunes of others. But cruelty has a way of taking root deeper than folks can see from the outside. That night, in the teeth of the storm, it revealed itself in a way no soul could excuse. Wrapped in nothing but a torn cloth, a newborn child was left out on the snow. The rancher had taken one look, turned his back, and walked away. Perhaps he figured the cold would finish the work before dawn, and the white drifts would hide what shame he wanted no one to claim. Perhaps he thought no one would ever know. The snow muffled everything except the sound of that baby's cry. Thin, sharp, and desperate, it cut through the storm like a blade, carrying out over the field and into the night. Not far off, alone, Ryder was making his way down the trail. His horse trudged slow through the drifts, each breath puffing steam in the frigid air. The man in the saddle was no stranger to hardship. He was the sort who kept his hat pulled low and his words few, a cowboy bound more to the open trail than to any one town. Folks who knew of him only spoke of his quiet ways, his worn saddle, and the way he always seemed to appear when trouble hung thick as smoke. Some said he carried his own ghosts, that the wide road suited a man who had nowhere left to call home. The cowboy had no reason to ride near the ranch that night, but fate has a hand in guiding men where they're most needed. When he heard the faint, aching cry rise above the storm, he pulled the reins and listened hard. At first he thought it might be the wind till it came again, sharper, closer, and unmistakably human. He spurred his horse through the snow, leaning forward against the gusts, his heart tightening with each sound. There, against the drift of white, he saw a small bundle nearly buried. The cloth was stiff with ice, the child inside red-faced, trembling, and gasping for breath. The cowboy dismounted quick, scooping the newborn into his arms, shielding it from the wind with his coat. His hands were rough, but his touch was steady. The baby's cries softened under the warmth of his chest, though its tiny body shook with cold that could take a life in minutes. The man looked around, scanning the ranch house lit dim in the distance. He knew then where the child had come from, and he knew too what kind of heart had left it there. Anger flared hot beneath his ribs, though his face stayed still as stone. He could have turned back toward the village, let the sheriff or preacher decide what came next. But something in the child's faint whimper, something in the way its small fist curled tight around his finger, told him this was now his burden to carry as he swung back into the saddle, cradling the newborn clothes. Snow continued to fall thicker, erasing tracks behind him. The night seemed endless, and the storm pressed in from every side, but the cowboy rode on, jaw set, eyes fixed. Ahead, he had no plan, no promise of shelter, only a fierce sense that this life was not meant to end in the cold. Somewhere, somehow, he would find a way. Back in the village, lamps still glowed behind frosted windows. Families huddled near their stoves. Unaware of the storm's cruel secret unfolding just beyond their doors, the saloon sat quiet, its piano long since stilled. Even the sheriff, a weary man who had seen his share of lawless deeds, dozed by his fire, unaware that justice was being tested in the dark. The cowboy pressed forward, each hoofbeat muffled by the snow. The child whimpered against his chest, its breath shallow but steady. He whispered low, Words meant more to calm himself than the baby, though maybe both found comfort in the sound. The weight of what he carried was more than flesh and bone. It was a chance at life, stolen from the jaws of death. And yet, as the storm raged on, and the village lights flickered faint in the distance, the cowboy knew this was only the beginning. The rancher's cruelty would not go unnoticed forever. Secrets in a small town never stay buried long, not even under snow. There would be questions, suspicions, reckonings to come. But for now, under the heavy silence of winter, all that mattered was the fragile heartbeat pressed against his chest, and the choice he had made to carry it forward. The trail stretched long and uncertain ahead, and the cowboy did not know if he had the strength, the shelter, or the allies to see this through. All he knew was that he could not set the child down again. Somewhere behind him, the ranch house stood dark, a place where warmth had been denied and mercy had been cast aside. Somewhere ahead, danger waited in forms he could not yet name. But with each step of his horse, with each breath that rose into the frozen night, the cowboy carried the weight of both life and justice in his arms. The storm howled louder, so the land itself bore witness, and in that desolate stretch of prairie, the line between cruelty and compassion had been drawn, waiting for the world to see what would come of it. The storm eased toward dawn, though the sky was still heavy and gray. Snow lay piled across the land, swallowing fences, barns, and even the familiar wagon paths that usually cut the prairie clear. The cowboy rode slow, his coat drawn tight around the fragile life he carried. The baby's breathing had steadied some, though faint as the soft wind that stirred the horse's mane. He kept glancing down, half afraid the child might slip into silence. Each small cry, each twitch of its tiny hands was proof that the fight wasn't lost yet. The village came into sight as the first weak light of morning pushed through the storm clouds. Smoke rose thin from chimneys, curling into the cold air. Life was stirring again behind shuttered windows, though no one yet knew what secret the cowboy carried in his arms. He guided his horse down the main street, past the frosted glass of the saloon, past the mercantile, where barrels of grain and flour stood half-buried under drifts. Few souls were outside at that hour. Only a stable boy paused in his work to watch the rider pass, curiosity flickering in his eyes before he went. Back to shoveling snow, the cowboy dismounted near the blacksmith's barn, a place where the forge kept heat burning steady through winter. He slipped inside, careful with the bundle in his arms, letting the warmth close in around him. The blacksmith was there, wiping soot from his brow, surprise crossing his face as he saw the cowboy enter with something hidden beneath his coat. Words hung unspoken for a moment until the cowboy pulled the cloth back just enough to reveal the newborn's face. The blacksmith's hands dropped to his sides. "Where'd you come by that?" he asked, voice rough with disbelief. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He knew better than to let words slip too quick in a town where talk traveled faster than horse hooves. Instead, he lowered himself onto a bench near the fire, letting the baby draw what warmth it could. The blacksmith stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he pieced together what kind of man would cast away his own blood into the storm rumors about the rancher had circled for years. Whispers of harshness behind closed doors, of workers driven to the bone, of cruelty hidden under wealth and pride. But leaving a newborn in the snow, that was something beyond even the worst stories. The blacksmith said nothing more, but his silence carried weight. The cowboy knew this secret wouldn't stay in the barn. Soon it would spread like sparks through dry brush, and with it would come anger, judgment, maybe even violence. The cowboy stayed long enough to feed the fire high. Wrapping the child in spare cloths the blacksmith offered, the warmth returned color to the baby's cheeks, though its cries had grown softer, more tired.
Out.
He had no milk, no proper way to care for a child, only the steady resolve that he could not abandon it. When he stepped back out into the village, the streets were waking. A woman swept snow from her steps. Men gathered by the stable to speak of fences lost to the storm. None noticed the bundle hidden in his arms, though. Soon enough they would. The cowboy kept his head down and moved on, heading toward the small church that stood at the edge of town. The preacher's wife opened the door. her eyes widening as the cowboy spoke few words, enough to show her the child in the cold night. It had endured. She gathered the baby quick, her hands gentle, her voice soft, as she soothed its cries. For the first time since he had found the newborn, the cowboy felt a flicker of relief. Yet even as the child lay safe in her care, he knew this was only the start. The rancher's sin could not be hidden, and the village would not forgive it. Easy. Inside the church, the fire burned small but steady. The cowboy leaned against the wall while the preacher and his wife tended to the baby. They asked questions, but he gave little in return. He spoke only of hearing a cry in the storm, of finding the child nearly frozen. He left the rancher's name unsaid, though the preacher's sharp eyes seemed to catch the truth between the lines. Some things didn't need to be spoken aloud. Word spread by noon. A child abandoned, a cowboy finding it in the snow. Mothers clutched their little ones tighter, fathers muttered curses under their breath, and old men spat in disgust at the thought. In a town where everyone relied on one another to survive the harsh seasons, the idea that a man of means could cast away his own flesh was more than wicked. It was a betrayal of everything they held together. The rancher did not come into town that day, nor the next. His shutters stayed closed, his men silent, but silence itself became an answer. Folks whispered in corners, weighing what should be done. Some wanted the sheriff to act, though others doubted the law would dare cross. A man with so much land and money? Others spoke of leaving justice to the people, and those words carried a dangerous edge. The cowboy kept mostly to the edge of things. It's never far from the church where the child now slept under warmer blankets. He listened more than he spoke, watching the way tempers built with each passing day. He had seen men talk themselves into violence before, and he knew how quickly a village could turn from peace to fury when pushed at night. He sat by the edge of town, staring out at the dark line of the ranch on the horizon. He thought of the man inside that house, the one who had left an innocent to the cold without a backward glance. He thought, too, of the small life he had carried against his chest, of the grip of tiny fingers on his calloused hand. The anger that burned in the townsfolk lived in him too, though quieter, deeper, like coals waiting under ash. But anger alone would not save the child's future, nor would it bring peace to the village. The cowboy knew the road ahead would not be simple. There were questions without answers why the rancher had done it, whether others had known, and what would become of the baby now. Each question twisted tighter around him. A knot that no easy blade could cut. The preacher urged patience. But patience was thin, in a place where survival meant swift action. Men gathered in the saloon, voices rising late into the night. Women whispered on doorsteps, their faces pale with shock. The sheriff walked the streets more often, his hand near his gun, though his eyes showed the weight of a man torn between duty and fear. Through it all, the cowboy stayed near the child. Not because he had claimed it as his own, but because he knew the weight of responsibility once you'd lifted it into your arms. He had not chosen this burden, but he could not set it down now. The snow melted little by little, revealing the muddy streets beneath. But the cold that settled over the village was not from winter alone. Something darker lingered in the air. A tension that stretched across every conversation and every glance toward the ranch on the hill. The cowboy could feel it growing, pressing in from all sides, and he knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The child had been spared the storm, but storms of another kind were coming. Storms made not of wind and snow, but of men's choices, pride, and vengeance. The cowboy sat his horse at dusk, the horizon glowing red behind the dark outline of the ranch house. The baby slept safe in the village, yet the weight of its future pressed heavy on him. Somewhere ahead, justice waited or ruin, and he could not yet see which path the town would take. The days that followed carried a weight that pressed on every soul in the village. Life went on in its ordinary shape, men repairing fences broken by the storm, women trading goods at the mercantile, children skating on the frozen pond, but beneath the rhythm of daily chores lay a current no one could ignore. It was in the way voices hushed when the rancher's name was spoken, in the sidelong looks cast toward the horizon where his land stretched wide, and in the restless air that filled the saloon at night when whiskey loosened tongues. The child had survived those first days thanks to the preacher's wife who fed and warmed it as if it were her own. She named it only in whispers, calling it Little One, as if to give a name might seal its fate before the truth was settled. Villagers came to see the baby, some out of pity, others out of morbid curiosity, many left with anger sharpened. In their eyes, in a place where kinship meant survival, the thought of a man abandoning his blood cut deeper than any feud over land or cattle. The cowboy watched all this unfold from the margins, never stepping too close, but never straying too far. He worked odd tasks for the blacksmith and helped the stable boy with the horses, but his eyes often drifted toward the church steeple where the child slept. He knew the whispers around town had begun to tie him to the baby, some folks wondering. If he was more than just a passerby, he didn't bother to correct them. In truth, he wasn't sure himself why he couldn't leave. Something in the cry he'd heard in the snow, something in the desperate hold of those small fingers, had fastened him here tighter than any rope. Meanwhile, tension grew thicker around the saloon tables. Men who had long worked under the rancher gathered in corners, trading stories of cruelty and long years of labor without kindness. One swore he'd seen the rancher strike a boy half his age for letting a gate swing open. Another told of cattle driven past the point of collapse in the heat of summer. These stories were not new, but spoken aloud now. They gathered force, building a case that could no longer be ignored. The bartender listened quiet, polishing glasses, though his eyes flicked sharp at every word. Everyone knew that sooner or later, word would reach the rancher's ears. The sheriff walked in one evening, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and the saloon fell to silence. He ordered a coffee instead of whiskey, sat at a corner table and listened. He was a tired man, his beard more gray than black now, his badge dulled by years of trying to keep peace, where peace was a fragile thing. He knew better than most what it meant to cross a man with power and money, yet as he sat there, listening to the talk that boiled hotter each night, saw how the tide was turning against the rancher, with or without his law. Not all were eager to see open conflict. Some families, tied to the ranch by wages or debts, held their tongues, fearful of what would happen if the rancher's wrath turned on them. They spoke in softer tones, urging patience, suggesting the preacher might settle things in a quiet way. But their voices were few, and fear often sounded like guilt in the ears of those who wanted justice. The preacher himself carried the weight heavy on his shoulders. Each Sunday he spoke of mercy and judgment, of sin and redemption, but the eyes of his congregation were not softened. They looked past his words, past the verses, toward the child asleep in his wife's arms. To them, Scripture alone could not mend what had been done. They wanted answers, and answers meant action. The cowboy felt it too. At night he sat by the blacksmith's forge or walked the empty streets, hearing the whispers carried on the cold wind. He thought of leaving, of saddling his horse, and riding until the prairie swallowed the town behind him. But each time he tried to picture it, he saw the child's face, pale and trembling in the snow, and he knew he could not abandon what he had carried through the storm. One afternoon, as he helped the stable boy mend tack, a rider came into town from the ranch. The man was broad-shouldered, hard-eyed, and silent as he tied his horse outside the saloon. Folks paused in their work to watch. He stayed inside only a short while, long enough to speak with the bartender and the sheriff, then rode back the way he came. No words were shared aloud, but suspicion crackled in the air afterward like dry lightning. Some believed the rancher had sent a warning. Others thought it was a sign he already knew what was being said in town. Either way, the message was clear. Silence was not an option much longer. That evening, the cowboy returned to the church, sitting near the back pew while the preacher's wife rocked the baby to sleep. The child's breathing was steady now, its cheeks fuller with milk and warmth. Watching, the cowboy felt both relief and unease. The stronger the baby grew, the sharper the question of what would become of it. Could the village raise a child marked by such a cruel beginning? Would the rancher try to claim it again, if only to silence the shame? These thoughts knotted in his chest until he could hardly breathe. Meanwhile, another story began to twist into the heart of the conflict. A young woman from the village, known for her quiet ways, was whispered to have ties to the ranch. Some claimed she had worked there in the past, others that she knew more than she let on about the rancher's household. Her name passed from mouth to mouth with curiosity and suspicion. When she walked through the mercantile one morning, all eyes followed, though no one spoke to her outright. The cowboy noticed the weight she carried in her gaze, the way she looked at the church door when passing, as though fighting a secret too heavy to bear. Her silence fed the fire of speculation. Some believed she might know the truth of the child's mother, or why the rancher had chosen such a cruel path. But no one dared press her. They held their tongues, though their minds burned with questions. The cowboy wondered if she might hold the key to everything, though he also knew that pushing her could drive her deeper into shadow. In a town strung tight with anger, one word from her could strike the spark that turned whispers into wildfire. The sheriff tried to steady things. Calling men together to speak plain, he warned against rash action, reminded them of law and order. But his words were met with mutters and clenched jaws. One man spat on the floor and said the law hadn't saved the child in the snow. Another asked what good the badge was if it bowed before money. The sheriff left with his shoulders heavy, knowing his authority was thinner than ice in spring as winter wore on. The ground thawed just enough to reveal tracks where snow had melted near the ranch. Children noticed first, pointing at the deep ruts where wagons had gone in and out late at night. No one knew what cargo they carried, but the sight fueled more suspicion. Was the rancher moving cattle? Hiding something? The cowboy watched from afar, uneasy. Secrets had a way of piling up until they could no longer be hidden. Each day the baby grew stronger, and each day the town grew closer to breaking. Conversations sharpened into arguments. Families divided between fear and fury. And always the ranch loomed at the edge of sight, its dark windows watching. The cowboy felt the weight of the choice pressing closer, though it was not his alone to make. One night, as the wind howled again through the prairie, the cowboy stood on the ridge outside town. In the distance, a single lantern burned in the sexton's the ranch house window. He thought of the man inside, the one whose cruelty had set this all in motion. He thought of the village, restless and ready to rise. And he thought of the child sleeping safe for now, though its very existence threatened to tear the town apart. The night was quiet except for the wind. But in that silence, the cowboy knew the storm ahead would not be made of snow. It would be made of men, of secrets, and of choices that could not be undone. And he could not yet see which side he would be forced to stand on when it finally broke. The thaw of early spring brought no peace to the village. The snow melted into mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels, but it was the kind of season where tempers burned hotter than the sun overhead. The baby, once weak and near frozen, had grown stronger in the care of the preacher's wife. Its cries now carried clear across the churchyard, a sound that should have been nothing but hopeful. Yet too many those cries were a reminder of what had been done, of the cruel hand that had cast the child into the storm, and of the reckoning that seemed closer with each passing day. The rancher had not shown his face in town for weeks. His silence was louder than any words could have been. Men spoke of it in the saloon, saying it was guilt, saying he was waiting for the anger to die down. Others claimed it was pride that he thought himself untouchable, safe behind the walls of his sprawling land and the hired hands who worked for him. Either way, every day he stayed hidden, the villagers' suspicion grew sharper. And in the quiet corners of town, talk turned to plans. The sheriff tried to keep control. But each time he walked into the saloon, men lowered their voices only long enough for him to leave. He warned them about taking matters into their own hands, but the weight of his badge seemed lighter than ever. When he passed the blacksmith shop one morning, he caught the cowboy's eye. They stood in silence a moment, two men who had carried their share of burdens. The sheriff finally said, "This town's set to split, and I don't reckon I can hold it together alone." He waited, as if hoping the cowboy would take sides. But the cowboy only gave a slow nod and turned back to the work at hand. The young woman tied to the ranch became the center of whispers more than once. She moved quietly through the streets, her face pale, her eyes downcast. Some claimed she was the child's mother, others that she knew what had happened behind the ranches. Closed doors. The cowboy noticed the way her steps faltered when she passed the church, how her gaze lingered on the doorway where the child sometimes lay in a cradle near the sunlit windows. He never pressed her with questions, though. He knew too well that forcing the truth out of someone often broke more than it fixed. Still, he could see the storm she carried inside her, and he knew sooner or later it would spill over. The preacher did his best to calm the restless hearts in his congregation, speaking of patience, of judgment belonging to God alone. But each Sunday, as the baby cooed softly in his wife's arms, the faces staring back at him were hardened. Men clenched their fists at their sides, women whispered behind their hands. The weight of the rancher's sin was no longer just his, had settled on the whole village, poisoning every thought, every prayer, every quiet moment. One evening, the cowboy found himself outside the saloon, leaning against the hitching post while voices rose inside. He heard the scrape of chairs, the heavy thud of boots on the floor. Men were arguing, loud enough that even the wind could not carry their words away. He knew then that the talk had gone beyond whispers. Plans were being shaped into action. And when men, with drink in their bellies and anger in their hearts, began to plan, nothing good followed. The young woman appeared again the next morning, standing near the mercantile, as though she had something to say, but could not yet force the words out. The cowboy approached her, slow and steady, and tipped his hat. She looked at him with eyes that seemed torn between fear and relief. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than the breeze, she whispered, "He'll never admit what he did. He'll fight before he bends." The cowboy studied her, waiting for more, but she turned and walked away, leaving only that single truth hanging heavy in the air. It was enough to confirm what he already knew. The rancher's pride was a wall no man could climb, the words alone. By the end of that week, the village was divided. Some wanted to march up to the ranch, demand justice, and drag the truth into daylight. Others argued it would only bring bloodshed. The sheriff called a meeting in the town hall, his voice cracking as he tried to keep order. But the arguments roared louder than his warnings, voices clashing until fists nearly flew. The cowboy stood near the back, silent, watching his neighbors, who had once shared bread and fire, now glared at one another like enemies. That night, the cowboy walked the ridge overlooking the ranch. A lantern burned in one window, just as it had many nights before, steady and defiant against the darkness. He thought of the child sleeping peacefully in the village, of the small heartbeat he had carried through the storm. He thought of the men gathering in the saloon, sharpening words into weapons. And he thought of the young woman's whisper, "He'll fight before he bends." The truth was plain now. The storm that had begun with one man's cruelty was about to break over them. All the next morning, wagon tracks cut deep into the muddy road leading from the ranch. They were fresh, made under cover of night. The stable boy spotted them first, running through the street to tell anyone who would listen. Soon a crowd gathered at the edge of town, staring out at the tracks that vanished into the horizon. Swore the rancher was preparing to flee, others that he was moving something he wanted hidden. The mystery of it only fed the fire. The preacher tried once more to calm them, raising his voice above the restless crowd, but his words were swallowed. By anger, men gripped their rifles tighter, their jaws set. Women held their children close, whispering prayers under their breath. And through it all, the baby's faint cry carried from the church, a reminder of the life that had sparked this storm. By evening, a group of men had gathered in the saloon, their decision made. They would ride to the ranch at first light, confront the man who had brought this shame upon their town, and demand the truth. The sheriff argued until his voice broke, warning them of bloodshed, of law, of consequences. But his words slid off them like rain off stone. Their minds were fixed, their anger sharp. The cowboy listened in silence, his face unreadable. When one of the men turned to him and asked where he stood, he only said, "I'll do what's right by the child." It was not the answer they wanted, but it was all he could give. That night was the longest the town had known. The air was thick with waiting. Horses were readied, rifles cleaned, lanterns trimmed. The women stayed close to the church, circling around the preacher's wife and the child, as though shielding them from the storm about to break. The young woman with ties to the ranch walked the streets like a ghost, her face pale, her hands trembling, as the cowboy saw her pause at the church door, pressing her palm against the wood as if she wanted to step inside but could not. The sheriff sat alone in his office, his badge glinting dim in the lantern light. He knew at dawn his choice would come: stand with the law and risk being swept aside, or stand with the people and risk losing what little order remained. His hand rested on his gun, but his eyes were filled with doubt. The cowboy saddled his horse under the moonlight, the leather creaking soft in the still air. He looked once more at the church, at the faint glow of firelight spilling from its ids, windows, and then toward the ranch, dark against the horizon. The choice before him was not one of sides, but of survival, of what justice truly meant when mercy and wrath tangled so tightly together, as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon. The village stirred. Men gathered with rifles slung across their shoulders. Women wept quietly, holding on to sons and husbands who might not return. The preacher stood in the church doorway, torn between his duty to his flock and his fear of what they were about to do. And in the cradle behind him, the child stirred, its cry piercing the silence of morning. The cowboy mounted his horse, the reins firm in his hands, his eyes fixed on the ranch in the distance. The village held its breath as the first riders moved forward, their shadows stretching long across the thawing ground. The sheriff stepped into the street, raising a hand to stop them, but his voice was drowned by the rumble of hooves. The young woman appeared suddenly, shouting words no one could hear over the noise, her face pale with terror. She tried to push through the crowd, her hands outstretched as if to stop the charge. The cowboy saw her lips move, saw the fear in her eyes, but the thunder of hooves carried her words away. The riders pressed on, their anger sharp, their rifles gleaming in the morning light. The ranch loomed ahead, silent and waiting, its windows dark, its fences unbroken. The air itself seemed to hold still, as if the land knew a storm greater than winter was about to break. And as the cowboy followed, his heart heavy, his hand never straying far from the gun at his side, he knew that everything, every secret, every choice, every life was about to collide on that stretch of land. The riders thundered across the thawing ground, mud flying beneath hooves, rifles clutched tight in their hands. The ranch loomed ahead, a shadow against the pale light of dawn. Windows dark, doors shut, it looked more like a fortress than a home. The air was so heavy with silence that even the horses snorted uneasily.
Ow.
The cowboy kept his distance behind. The first line of riders, his hand steady on the reins, his other resting close to his gun. He had no wish to spill blood. But he knew the choice might come before the day was done. The sheriff tried one last time to halt them, his horse cutting across their path, his voice raw as he shouted for law, for patience, for reason. But the words were swept aside by the weight of the men's anger. They were past reason now, carried forward by a fire that had burned too long without being answered. The preacher stood at the edge of town, helpless as he watched them disappear. Toward the ranch, his prayers lost to the cold morning air. When they reached the front gates, the ranch hands stood waiting. Some carried rifles, others only pitchforks, but their eyes were hard. They were men bound by wages and fear, and though not all agreed with what their master had done, loyalty and survival chained them to his side. The standoff stretched thin, the space between the two groups filled only with the creak of leather and the restless shuffle of horses. It was the young woman who broke the silence. She appeared from behind the riders, her face pale but her voice sharp as she cried out. All eyes turned to her, even the ranch hands lowering their weapons for a moment. She stepped forward, trembling, and shouted words that had long burned her throat. The child was hers. The rancher was the father, and he had cast the newborn into the storm out of pride and shame. Unwilling to let the truth stain his name, gasps rippled through the riders, fury turning sharper now that the last piece of the truth lay in the open. The rancher himself appeared at the door, his face set like stone, his eyes cold as steel. He did not deny it. Instead, he stood tall, daring them to act. His pride was the same that had driven him to the act, and even now, facing the wrath of an entire town, he would not bend. The sheriff raised his hand, trying to speak, but his voice was drowned by the shouts of the riders. Rifles were lifted, men ready to strike. The cowboy felt the moment tighten like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap and spill blood across the mud. He nudged his horse forward, his voice steady as he spoke above the chaos. He reminded them of the child, of why they had come. They had come not for vengeance, but for justice, for a future where no man's pride could weigh heavier than a life. For a moment, the fury faltered. The riders hesitated, their fingers loosening on the triggers. The sheriff seized the pause, shouting that the law would hold, that the rancher would answer for his crime in the open, not in the dust of his yard. Reluctantly, and only because the cowboy's words had cut through their rage, the rifles lowered. But their eyes still burned with the promise that if law failed them, they would not hesitate again. The rancher was taken under guard, his own men stepping aside rather than face the fire of the whole village. He spat at the ground as they bound his hands, his pride unbroken, even in chains. The young woman wept quietly, the weight of her secret finally unburdened, though the scar it left would not fade easy. Back in the village, the preacher's wife placed the child into her arms. For the first time, she held her baby without fear, though sorrow clouded her joy. The preacher spoke soft words over them both, not of judgment, but of forgiveness, urging the town to see that the future of the child should not be chained to the sins of its father. The sheriff carried out his duty, escorting the rancher to face trial beyond the village. Some doubted the law of the wider world would be harsh enough, but others believed the act of taking him from his land, stripping away his power, was punishment enough. The riders who had once readied for blood now watched in silence, their anger dulled, though not forgotten. The cowboy stayed behind, watching the village slowly return to its rhythm. The church bells rang on Sunday, children played in the mud of thawing streets, and the mercantile reopened its doors. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds lingered something changed. The people had faced a storm not of snow, but of pride and cruelty, and though it had nearly broken them, they had stood together. The young woman began to walk with her head higher, no longer burdened by whispers. The child thrived in her arms, its cries no longer a reminder of shame, but of survival. The preacher spoke often of second chances, of how life could bloom even in the harshest winter. And the sheriff, though tired, carried his badge with a bit more weight, knowing he had seen the law tested and still standing. One evening, the cowboy sat outside the blacksmith's barn, the firelight flickering behind him. The blacksmith joined him, silent for a while, before asking if he would stay. The cowboy gave no clear answer. His life had always been the road, the wide-open prairie, the endless horizon. Yet when he thought of the child's tiny hands clutching at his coat, he felt a pull stronger than any trail he had ridden. For days he lingered, helping where he could, his quiet presence steady as the town rebuilt itself. But in time he knew the road would call again. The child was no longer his to protect it, had a mother, a community, and a future no longer shadowed by the rancher's pride. His place was only ever to carry it through the storm, to make sure it saw the dawn. On the morning he left the village, gathered to see him off. The preacher offered a prayer, the blacksmith a firm handshake, the sheriff a nod of respect. The young woman stood with her child in her arms, her eyes meeting his with gratitude too deep for words. The cowboy tipped his hat, his face unreadable, but his heart heavy. Then he swung into the saddle, the horse's hooves carrying him away. From the village and back into the wide-open land, behind him the church bell rang, its sound carrying across the prairie. Ahead, the horizon stretched endless, the sky vast and waiting. The cowboy did not look back, but in his chest he carried the memory of a child's cry in the snow, of a village bound together by one act of cruelty and the strength to rise above. The storm had passed, but its lesson lingered, that even in the coldest nights, when pride and cruelty threatened to snuff out hope, there could still be hands willing to lift, to carry, and to keep life safe until the dawn. And with that, the cowboy rode on, a lone figure against the prairie sky, leaving behind a story that would be told long after the snow melted from the fields.